today's verse is 229, and as we went over earlier, it goes Ascharyavat pashyati kaschidinam Ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyah Ascharyavat chainamanyah shrinoti Shrutvapianam vedana chaiva kaschid. So, the core meaning of this verse is that some see the soul as completely astonishing. Some speak of it as if the soul is astonishing. Some hear about it as astonishing. Yet, even after hearing about it, hardly anyone truly understands the soul. So this one is a pretty simple verse that is actually pretty easy to understand. Now, based off of the way Ashcharya is repeated 3 times and the way I repeated astonishing 3 times in the core meaning, I think you can infer that Ashcharya means astounding. So after all of the explanations that Krishna has given Arjuna, this verse is almost as if it's a moment of reflection. Krishna has spent verses explaining the soul cannot be killed, the soul cannot be burned, it cannot be cut, it cannot be changed, it is eternal, it's unborn, it's beyond the senses, beyond ordinary thought, bodies appear and disappear, the soul continues its journey despite the body dying. And then Krishna basically says, even after hearing all of that, do you truly understand how extraordinary the soul truly is? And Krishna here, he's basically answering his own question. He's saying most people don't. And that's exactly what this verse is about. So, Ashcharyavat pashyati kashidenam. This means some behold the self as astonishing. Some think that the soul is completely astonishing. It's shocking. Just the nature of the soul is something difficult to comprehend. So, as I said earlier, the word Ashcharya means astonishing, or you could say wondrous, extraordinary, something that inspires amazement. Krishna isn't saying that the soul is merely just, it's just interesting. No, that is completely downplaying it. He's saying that the soul's nature is so far beyond ordinary that genuine realization, it produces wonder. Think about how we react when we encounter something that completely exceeds our expectations. Sometimes you might just say, oh, that's cool. But if it genuinely exceeds your expectations, then you would stop. You stare. You struggle to find words. You're shocked. This is the kind of response that Krishna is describing. The self is astonishing because everything we normally experience is fully changing. The body changes, the mind changes, emotions change, circumstances change. Yet Krishna says that there is something within us that remains fundamentally unconditional and unchanged through all of the change that's happening all around us, and that is difficult for our ordinary minds to grasp. So, why is the soul so difficult to understand? It's because we're surrounded by things that behave completely differently. Everything we see has a beginning. Everything we see changes. Everything we see eventually has an end. As I've mentioned previously, the 6 stages of material existence, they show that everything that's material, everything that you can see with your own eyes that are material, they have a beginning and they have an end. Let's say you see this iPad in front of me. It had a beginning. It was manufactured in blank, blank, blank date. It has an end. It's eventually gonna break. It's eventually gonna stop working, or it eventually might just get cracked and all of it might just go kaboom. I don't know. It's just gonna stop working. So, our minds naturally assume, that's just how existence works. It comes, it does its purpose, it dies. We see a baby. The baby grows, the person ages, the person eventually dies. So therefore, our senses teach us to associate existence with manifestation. Krishna has spent the previous verses breaking that assumption. He's saying you are trying to understand the eternal using tools that are designed to understand the temporary. So that's why the soul seems so astonishing to somebody who does not fully know its nature and cannot absorb themselves into learning about the nature and the wonder of the soul. Now, Ashcharyavad vadati tathaiva chanyah, meaning others speak of it as astonishing. Someone may understand the teaching of the soul so deeply that they themselves can explain it, and they can talk for hours just about the soul. They may teach that the soul is eternal. They may teach that the body changes. The self cannot be destroyed. They may give beautiful explanations. They may quote scriptures. They may teach an entire class about the Atma or the soul. But Krishna is making an important distinction. Being able to talk about the self is not automatically the same as realizing the self. Just because you can talk about it doesn't mean you have fully realized it. Just because you talk about being so determined to get a 99 does not mean that you're going to get a 99. There's a quote, I don't remember how it fully goes, but something similar to saying talking about it is easier than doing it. So just being able to talk about it does not mean that you can do it, unfortunately. That's pretty sad, because it would be cool to talk about something and then have it completely happen in front of us. But anyway, Krishna has made that important distinction. Someone can describe the ocean without ever swimming in it. Someone can explain music theory without ever being moved by a song. Someone can explain meditation without actually becoming inwardly still. And likewise, spiritual knowledge can exist at the level of speech without it being spiritual realization. Now, Ashcharyavacchaina manyashrinoti, meaning others hear about it as astonishing. Someone hears the soul is eternal and thinks, oh, that's incredible, that's so cool, that's amazing. But then they go back to everyday life like, oh, that was just a piece of information that goes through my right ear and leaves through the left. The idea remains something that they heard. It hasn't necessarily transformed their perception. This is why listening is important, but listening isn't just enough. Listening isn't sufficient. So, the Gita repeatedly emphasizes a process: hearing, reflecting, understanding, realizing, and then living accordingly. Hearing begins the journey, but just because you can hear it doesn't mean you live accordingly. It doesn't finish the journey. So, Shrutva pyenam vedana chaiva kashchit, even after hearing, hardly anybody knows. So, that is the line that hits the hardest, because even after hearing about the self, even after hearing about the soul, hardly anyone truly knows about the soul. Why? Because the soul isn't simply just another piece of information that, as I said earlier, goes in through one ear and exits through the other. You can memorize that the soul is eternal. You can memorize that the soul cannot be destroyed. You can memorize that the soul is unborn. You can memorize all of that, but just because you have memorized it does not mean that you have realized it. There's a massive difference between knowing a statement and knowing the reality that is described by the statement. Now, here's an easy example for this. You can read about the taste of mangoes. You can memorize the descriptions of the mangoes. You can watch videos. You can listen to people explain the flavor of a mango. You could write an entire essay about mangoes, but still not actually taste one. So just like that, similarly, the Gita can tell you about the soul. A teacher can explain it, a student can study it, but realization requires something deeper than just intellectual agreement. It requires full transformation of one's understanding of identity. And now here, according to Sankaracharya, he thinks that this difficulty exists because the soul is fundamentally different from everything else we know. As I said earlier, everything around us is made for temporariness? I don't know. It's made temporarily, right? But the soul is not temporary. The soul is eternal. It is made to be eternal, and that's the difference, because our mind, our subconscious, has already understood that everything around us is temporary. Oh yeah, because of the material 6 stages of material existence. Now because your subconscious has realized that, it applies it to something that's eternal too. Now that is where you're wrong. Normally when we say I know something, there are 3 components. There is the knower, the act of knowing, and the object being known. But the soul is the knower. It is consciousness itself. Therefore, the soul cannot be understood as merely another object that's sitting outside us waiting to be observed. That's why Sankaracharya, he emphasizes self-knowledge. You aren't discovering some foreign object that you found from the 1900s. Okay, technically you may have found that from the 1900s. I can't say nothing about that. But you're not describing some foreign object. You're recognizing what you fundamentally are. The difficulty isn't that the soul is absent, but the difficulty is that the ignorance causes us to identify with what is not the soul. The body, the mind, the ego, the roles, temporary circumstances. Once that misunderstood identity is removed, then the self becomes recognized as the ever-present reality. Now, on the other hand, Ramanujacharya also emphasizes that the extraordinary nature of the individual soul, while maintaining an important distinction from Sankaracharya. For Ramanujacharya, the soul is genuinely individual. It does not simply dissolve into some undifferentiated identity. The soul remains itself while existing in an eternal relationship with the Supreme Lord. And that relationship is what makes the soul's nature even more remarkable, because the soul, as I've mentioned at least 100 times, is eternal, conscious individual, dependent upon God, capable of knowing and loving God, all of the above, okay? And thus, truly understanding the soul means understanding both who we are and our relationship to the Supreme. Okay, thank you.